Hey everyone, I'm TJB Chris. Welcome back to the channel, or if you're one of the very large handful of new subscribers I got, welcome to the channel. I'm glad you're here and I hope you like it. I do videos covering all lines of Tandy computers and all levels of technical depth on these machines. I grew up on these machines and I love them. And with that in mind, it is my favorite time of the year because it is Septandy. Septandy, when creators all over the internet and people like me celebrate all things Tandy. And this month I'm indulging my tendency toward the thematic, just like in previous years, with my new series.
Now, storage on the 8s, accurate and dependable from TJB Chris.
This is my in-depth look at storage options on the TRS-80 8-inch systems, those being the Models 2, 12, 16, 16B, and the Tandy 6000. Believe it or not, there's a fair number of storage options from floppy disks, hard disks, and beyond that create a rather confusing set of combinations. In fact, when it comes to hard disks, we have similarly sounding yet incompatible combinations of interface and controller combinations, along with competing nomenclatures for those same combinations. And to put the cherry on top of it, we've got a rather confusing set of terms and version numbers as it relates to TRSDOS, the operating system for these machines. So this month, over this series of videos, I hope to untangle all of that for you with some demonstration. And unlike a lot of my previous videos, this one will have a lot more talk and be a little more educational, but I'll try my best to make it interesting. I've seen over the years a fair number of folks fairly confused when they come in to try to get into these systems because of the confusing floppy compatibility, hard disk controller options, and TRSDOS versions out there. So I'm hoping to untangle that for you. I'll make sure that the chapters are set up just right in each video so that you can find what you're looking for and not listen to too much jabbering. Alright, so with that in mind, tonight we're going to take a look at the first topic in the series, floppy diskettes. Well, floppy disks aren't the biggest topic. There are different options available for these machines depending on which hardware model you've got and which operating system you're running. And I'll be getting into more detail about operating systems in particular in the third part of the series, but we will mention them here where it's important to do so. So, let's talk about floppy disks and the 8-inch systems. So before we get started, I kind of wanted to just give you an idea for those of you who really aren't familiar about the size comparisons on some of these diskettes. Because an 8-inch diskette is rather large. You may not even realize just how large they are. In fact, they're almost as big as my head, and I have a pretty big cranium if I do say so myself. But this is an 8-inch floppy. It's a fairly large disk, and to give you an idea for comparison, this is the Xenix boot disk for the Xenix operating system upgrade that you may have seen on my previous video on the channel. For comparison, this is a 5¼ inch floppy disk from the Color Computer 3. This is the OS9 Level 2 disk. So they're quite a bit smaller, and yet, I mean, this is double density and this is double density. Both are double-sided, or can be, but this is the size. And just for the reference of comparison, the last of the floppy disks, the 3½er. So when you're looking at this, there's really quite a big difference in size. The other thing I want to cover really quickly when you're coming into these that's often a point of confusion is write protection. So if I take a look at this 8-inch disk here, you're going to see that I have my index hole up here at the top, not where you'd normally find it, and I have a notch down here, and that notch is covered. So on a 5¼ inch diskette, this notch, if covered, would mean write protect me. In this case, this means I'm writable. So the default state of one of these 8-inch disks is write protected. So you've got to cover it with a notch. Well, cover the notch if you want it to be writable. And of course, that's in contrast to the 5¼ inch floppy, which I'll show you here. This is my OS9 Level 2 System Master. Last I knew this worked. This notch uncovered means you can write me. And of course, there's my index hole. Finally, of course, on the 3½ inch disk, we have our little flippy protector, our density hole here for high density versus double density, and of course the write protect notch is just this nice little switch so you don't have to have little stickers to come off in your drive. It's also worth noting that while I don't have any double-sided media on me for 8-inch drives, there's another notch in there that indicates whether the disk is double-sided or not. That's what tells the drive. And that's going to become relevant later in this video because when we get to adapting modern floppy drives or emulators, you're going to have to know that information. Okay, so with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about the disk format on these 8-inch systems. The on-disk format of these drives is derived from the IBM 3740-based format, the original 8-inch disk as I understand it. This is a soft-sectored format. IBM originally used 26 sectors per track, which the initial Model 2 line system format did in fact use. IBM had originally used 73 tracks per disk, single-sided, while Tandy used 77 tracks per disk, single-sided. We'll talk more about that when we talk about the individual drive configurations for the machine. I said I didn't have any double-sided disks, but I did happen to find one, and you can see there's the Write Protect notch cover, making the disk writable, and then just to the right of that, the way the disk sits, is another notch that will indicate whether the disk is double-sided. So if you've got 2 notches on the disk, it's double-sided. If you've got 1 notch, it is single-sided. The amount of total storage per disk varied depending on how the disk was formatted on the operating system. All models, 2, 12, 16, 16B, and 6000 could run all versions of TRSDOS for this line of systems, and therefore the disk capacities are about the same. A single-sided disk on TRSDOS 2.0 with its 26 sectors per track allowed for 475K per disk roughly. If you were looking at a TRSDOS 2 or TRSDOS 4.x formatted disk, the number of sectors per track went up to 32, therefore allowing 600K per side. Because the 16, 16B, 6000, and the Model 12 all had double-sided disks, you could get up to 1.2 megabytes per disk on these systems. It's worth noting that almost all releases of software that Tandy ever did were on single-sided diskettes. I imagine that was mainly for compatibility. Why alienate Model 2 people with a piece of software they can't buy because they've got single-sided drives? The Model 2 was the only system that had single-sided drives out of the box. It had one internal Sugar SA800 8-inch floppy drive whose AC motor ran all the time. If the machine was powered, that 120-volt AC motor was running. To prevent the head from just completely destroying the media from being in contact with it and constantly spinning, the head had a solenoid that would remove it from the disk and clamp it down when access was necessary. The Model 2 had 2 different floppy controller cards installed throughout its lifetime. This means that early models required a terminator pack on the disk expansion connector on the back of the machine. Failure to have one in place would cause the machine to act erratically and fail to work properly. So if you have a Model 2 that seems like it should be working but you can't get disks to work, you might have an early Model 2 that needs that terminator. I'm not sure where you can find one of those, or even if there's a reproduction effort online. Later FDC implementations did not require the terminator on the external port. The models 16, 16B, 12, and the Tandy 6000 did not require a floppy terminator pack on the expansion connector for the floppy drives. It's worth noting that the Model 2 had available for it a disk expansion system which used that external connector, which added up to 3 additional drives to the TRS-80 Model II. These drives were CDC drives, Controlled Data Corp, I believe, and they were the same 77-track single-sided format of the drive internal to the Model II. The single-drive version of this expansion system was 26-4160 and was available for $1,150. You could add an additional 2 drives to the system if you needed, in the mid-$2,000 range, if you wanted to get 3 drives. In fact, Tandy made available a computer stand with cabinet space built in for the Model 2 and its accompanying disk system, and if you really wanted to glamp it up, you could add yourself a printer stand to the side and have yourself a complete Model 2 setup with furniture and 3-bay disk expansion system for your Model 2. If you've got one of these disk expansion systems connected to your machine, it needs to be on whenever the machine is operating. So the startup sequence for these systems is very important when you have external peripherals attached. All drives on the Model 2, at least from Radio Shack, are double density and single-sided, though as I mentioned, track 0, side 0, is in fact formatted FM or single density. Now let's talk about the models 16, 16B, and the Tandy 6000. All of these machines had derivations of the Tandy TM848 drives. These drives have a bit of a reputation, but fear not. They're not quite as unreliable as they might seem to be. It's kind of cool to knock the drives, and quite frankly, you do run the risk, if you use them improperly, of damaging the drive and then later subsequent disks. The main problem here being that the disk eject spring in the drive is a little overzealous, and if you happen to turn the handle slowly to release the disk and the eject spring starts to eject the disk before the head clears the disk jacket, the jacket will rip the head off the drive, and then when you put another disk in, it'll have a hanging head there that'll grind into your disk, and it will neither read nor will your disk ever work again. And any subsequent disk you put in there will also be summarily destroyed. However, if you have one of these systems and the drive works, be sure to use a quick snapping action to open the drive handle and you should be fine. An alternative here is you can disable the disk eject spring if you're so inclined and just pull the disk out yourself. These drives on all models beyond the 2, the 16, the 12, the 16B, and the Tandy 6000 were double-sided, although, like I mentioned, Tandy releases were almost exclusively single-sided. A disk expansion system was available for all these machines. Now, unlike the Model 2, these machines had the possibility for 2 built-in 8-inch floppy drives. As a result of this, the external bays for these systems only had 2 drive slots in them, and drive 0 and 1 were always internal. The expansion drives for these systems, catalog number 2264165, available for about $1,300 with one drive, was available during the lifetime of these systems. I don't know how many of these were sold. I think I ever saw one on eBay once. The Model 2 disk expansion systems seem fairly prevalent and show up a fair amount. In the case of the Model 16 and up systems, the disk expansion system uses the same TM848 tandem drives that are in these machines. Now I know what you're saying to yourself. TJB Chris, who's now leaning on his Model 12 for some inexplicable reason. What do I do in the modern times? You're talking about all these 8-inch discs, but media is getting harder to find, the drives are getting older and wearing out. And quite frankly, these were business systems and their drives saw a lot of miles. So even if they were reliable back in the day, I can't expect a whole lot now. And I tell you that there's a solution to that. And that solution is these great things, or anything like them. This particular one is a Lotharek. It's an HXC emulator, floppy emulator. I use these things a fair amount. But use flash floppies if you choose. But TJB Chris, you're saying to yourself, regular Shugart floppies for PCs like these emulators have 34 pins, and the TRS-80 Model II, 12, 16, 16B, and 6000 have 50 pins. What say you? And I say, check this out. And now a closer look. This is the FD50-34 by NF6X. This adapts the 50-pin floppy drive controller interface on the 8-inch systems down to your standard 34-pin Shugart interface that we know and love on IBM PCs, color computers, and all manner of other systems. This interface is, I don't know if it's available build to order or not. I built all but one of these. That, in fact, this particular one I did not build because it came with the Model 12 back there. And you'll see there's some jumpers for configuring different options that are well documented on this project's GitHub. The most important jumper for me is the 2-side option. If you mount a disk image in your drive emulator or even in a real floppy drive that is double-sided, you need to jump the 2-side jumper here. If not, you just need to leave that hanging there as I do. I never use double-sided images with this just because, quite frankly, all the Tandy releases were single-sided, and because I'm using emulated floppy disks, I can just put in another disk. So I don't even bother with doing 2-sided with anything. If you leave this jumper incorrectly set, it will confuse the operating system, at least giving you an error and at most corrupting your data. So let's take a look at how this thing is connected, where it's connected, and we'll connect up the floppy emulator. Then we're going to take a look at the Model 2 archive, where you can find all sorts of great software for these machines, and we're going to convert an image over to a floppy disk, load it into the emulator, and boot the machine with it. Here we are at the back of the Model 12. You can see here I've got the interface cable for my Fred. We'll talk about that in the next video here, but I'm going to remove the expansion cover here. While I'm doing that, this is the machine that has my 3D printed card cage in it and the Tandy Emeritus backplane. So it's not going to look exactly like a stock machine, but it is awesome and finely expanded. Anyway, taking a look here, we have our card cage. We've got our hard disk interface board that we'll talk about next time. We've got our video and keyboard interface. And attached to said interface, we have a high-res graphics card, which hasn't really been shown on the channel, but I have sent out a couple of posts on various social media platforms about. Anyway, a little bit closer now, and this is the 50-pin floppy interface cable for the floppy drive emulator that I'm using. But you'll notice that it is not connected to the floppy expansion connector on the motherboard here. Why would that be? Why would I not connect the cable to the easiest connector available to me? And that's because the drive select lines available on this connector do not reflect all the lines available to the floppy controller. There is a separate controller port on the motherboard into which this cable is connected that brings the internal floppy drive selects out. So on this cable, which is the motherboard's internal floppy interface cable, which is back a ways, drive selects 0 and 1 are on this connector, and that's because the models 12, 16, 16B, and 6000 can all have up to 2 internal floppy drives. This connector has 2 drive selects, but those selects relate to drives 2, and 3. So if you connect a drive here and configure it as 0, you're not going to get anything. To be able to use a Lotharek or any other floppy emulator as drive 0 or 1 on a 16, 12, 16B, or 6000, it must be connected to the internal floppy drive connector. Generally speaking, this is done in place of the floppy drives, as I've done on my 16. If you want to connect drives external using the external connector, they will be drives 2 and 3. It's worth noting that on a Model 2, the only internal drive select, as far as I know, is drive 0, but I don't have a Model 2 with experience on that. So if that's not quite right, let me know in the comments. So let's connect this up, shall we? So let's take our connector here. I've got pin 1, and I've got my NF6X adapter, and noting that on a male side of this, pin 1 is where my thumb is, right here. So I'm going to make sure that the stripe lines up with pin 1 and clamp that down. There we are. And of course I have my 2-side jumper. It's just kind of floating there. It's not actually connected. Now I'm going to take my ribbon cable for my floppy drive here. And this is a 34-pin connector. I use a fairly long cable here. Do not use cables with twists in them. It's going to confuse matters. Just use a straight through 34-pin IDC cable. And I'm going to make sure I just push this in. And again, IDC rules. Pin 1 over here. All right, now let's connect this up to the Lotharek. All right, first things first, let's connect the power. So I've got my Lotharek here. And this particular unit has a USB interface on it. So I've just got a USB connected to a power adapter on my power strips here. But many of these, this also actually has a barrel jack on it. Most of these, or a lot of the ones I've come across, just have your standard 3.5-inch PC floppy drive power connector on there. So you can use one of those as well. In this case, I'm good with USB. Now on to the interface cable. It's worth noting that pin 1, which is indicated by the blue over here, if you can see that, is where we need to go. And if I hold this thing upside down, you can see that given the notch, pin 1 is over here. So I've got to make sure that I put this in with the blue going this way. And there we go. Blue, notch orientation blue over here. We are good. One more thing it's worth noting is that you can kind of check once you've got this all connected if you've got it connected correctly. Because if I put the card in, you can see the display lights up. If I don't see that it looks like it's trying to read a disk, you're probably in pretty good shape. The machine is off. Because what ends up happening is if you connect it the wrong way, you ground out a bunch of pins that make it think that something's being accessed, or like drive A is selected. So it will change its display here. So if this happens and nothing happens, you're probably in pretty good shape. When you go to boot up, it's actually going to work. Okay, now that we've done that, let's go out to the bench and we're going to download a floppy disk image from the Model 2 archive. We're going to use the HXC emulator tooling to convert the disk over. Then we're going to come back here and boot it on this Model 12. All right, folks, here we are out of the bench. I apologize for the poor light, but even though there's poor light, you might have noticed we have a little trademark adult beverage. Don't want to overdo it, but sometimes a little bit of whiskey goes a long way. All right, so I have my SD card here from the Lotharek, and I have this SD card adapter for this particular machine. Just going to put this in here. And you'll notice here I'm recording, so I know the filming the screen kind of sucks, so hopefully I can do this way. And up popped the notification that it doesn't like the file system on this thing, because that's what happens when you run these in emulators. And now I'm going to go to github.com/pski, and I'm going to go to Model 2 Archive. And since it's already in my history, we're just going to go there. And we're going to go, if you haven't checked out the Model 2 Archive, link will be in the video description and at the top there where I was just pointing. Check out this archive. Just do a git pull on your machine. But anyway, for the sake of demonstration, I'll do this. We're going to go to Tandy, and we're going to find a version of TRSDOS we want to play with. And let's play with TRSDOS 4.4, the last release, unofficially released, 1985, 731. And we're going to download this image. And we're going to download it. Okay, now that the file's downloaded, we've got to convert it to the HXC. Let's do that. All right, here we are, HXC emulator loaded. This converts a lot of different floppy formats over to the HFE image format used by the Lotharek. It's a bit of a step. A lot of folks don't like it, but honestly, it's Not something I do terribly often, and it does work very well. I've had good luck with these emulators. So I'm going to load my floppy image, and I'm going to go to Downloads, and this is my image here. It's the catalog number 260-4902. Little tidbits of information from my last video. I double-clicked it to load it. Now I'm going to click Export. I'm going to choose my D drive, because that's where Windows told me it was, and I'm going to call this TRSDOS 4 underbar 4, and I'm going to hit enter, and it very quickly gave me a progress bar, and now we're all set. So now let's eject the disk. We're just going to close this here, eject the disk, and we're going to be done. Back at the Lotharek, I have the image on my SD card here. Let's just get this put in. I'm going to try and hold this up so you can see the display. The USB cable's a little short, but there we are. It'll mount the last mounted image, but it always starts in the root directory. So as soon as you push next or previous, I'll just go to previous. Oh, there it is, TRSDOS 4.4. The great thing about this is if you put it in the root directory and hit the previous button, it'll always show you the latest loaded file. At least that's been my experience. So TRSDOS 4.4, I hit enter. Let's boot up this Model 12. And here we are, moment of truth. I have the Fred connected. Ooh, I heard it seek, so I'm going to hold repeat break. There we go. Now TRSDOS 4.4 doesn't show the 64K of memory to test anymore. It just goes to loading, which this is doing. And there we are. We're booted. TRSDOS 4.4, May 30th, 1985. And this is 9:05:2024. And it is currently 20.55. And there we are. We have a working floppy disk image on the Lotharek, ready to go. And I realize folks with flash floppy and the USB drives will be like, hey man, you don't have to do the conversion, and I get it. Now, admittedly, you're not going to see much here because most of the files are system files, but I can just run basic. And there we are. We're going to have basic coming up. You can hear the floppy seeking as we go. And there we are. But you know, I think there's at least one more scenario that we want to look into. So for that, we're going to move over to my TRS-80 Model 16B, and we're going to take a look at what happens when you have a real floppy drive and one of these Lothareks connected. And there we are, connected to the floppy expansion connector. And on this machine, since it could have up to 2 internal floppy drives, only drives 2 and 3 from a TRSDOS standpoint, it is connected to the NF6X adapter, which of course is connected over to the Lotharek, which is right here. So let's boot this thing up and we'll take a look at what that looks like. Back around front, and I've decided that I need a physical floppy disk copy of TRSDOS 4.4. I don't have one. So what I'm going to do here actually is I have my TRSDOS 4.4 image now mounted into the Lotharek just as it was before, but I've reconnected the Fred hard disk emulator back to the 16B, and that's because it's got a copy of TRSDOS 2 version 4.25 on it, and I'm going to need that, and booting this from the hard disk actually makes this much easier. So I'm going to power you up, and we should boot straight from the hard disk, and the Fred gets finicky. I'll just hit reset again and hope it doesn't hard lock. I think we got it this time. Yep. Okay, here we go. And again, it is the next day, 6/20/24, and it is 07.45. Okay, I'm going to do click, off. Okay, and now I'll get into the specifics of eccentricities with what drives can do what under what versions of TRSDOS in part 3 of this series when I talk about TRSDOS. But for the sake of this quick discussion and just making a real disk from the emulator here, I'm going to make sure that I have drive 2, which is the emulator. It is online, door detect off, that's correct. Ooh, it's got caching because TRSDOS 4.4 has caching. And we're set. All right, so the very first thing I need to do is I need to format a new diskette in drive 0. So we're going to do that first. And there's no disk in there, drive not ready. Oh, guess what you need? You need write protect tabs. So in my box of new open box die-stand diskettes, I have the write protect labels. So I'm going to do this. Now we're going to try again. I even have the original labels, so once I'm done with this, I can label it. All right, yes. All right, yes. All right, we're going to let this format. And we'll be back when it's done. All right, disk formatting completed, 0 flawed sectors. We'll let this thing write disk ID and directory information. Okay, disk successfully formatted. Right, all right, disk format successfully completed. Let's get a little closer here, and I'll back up from drive 2, which is the emulator, to drive 0, and then we'll try booting with our newly made TRSDOS 4.4 disk. Now that we're a little closer, we're going to issue the backup command, and I've got a nice little pillow here for the emulator so you can see its display. You should be able to see it go back and forth between the drive 2 to drive 0. So I'm backing up 2, that's this guy, to drive 0. Here we go. Unable to read source disk ID. Let's make sure that image is actually good. Let me reread that. Okay, let's try this again. 2, 2, 0. Okay, destination contains data. Copy over, yes. There we go. And for this, we're just going to sit here and watch this. This is part of life with disks, folks. And this was super convenient for us back in the day. I mean, for business systems like the Model 2 line systems, this was pretty much required. Floppy drives were required. You weren't doing cassettes, and then even hard disks became required, which is why even these machines can boot directly from hard disks. And it is worth noting, while this is making this disk, that I do this merely because I have working 8-inch disks and drives, and because there's a little bit of a neat wow factor here. But for anything substantial, if I'm working on disk data that I want to hold on to, anything like that, I use the modern storage options for this. I like, the purist in me likes having working floppy drives, but the practical person in me knows that these media are only getting less reliable over time. They're just aging. The same goes with the drives. And because these were business systems, these drives have a ton of miles on them, most likely. And even machines that were Xenix boxes might have fewer, but that also means you've got drives that were sitting for a while. So it's not necessarily bad to use these, but I wouldn't use them for anything critical. That's my own personal opinion. Others may disagree. I know there are folks out there that will only use real floppies, and my hat's off to you folks, because in this day and age, I just can't do that. And there's a real nice convenience that comes with floppy emulation these days. You never run out of media. Just make a new file. You really have, boundless possibilities here. Boundless, that's a word I just pulled out at 7-something in the morning. And believe it or not, there's something kind of fun to just sitting here and watching two drives go back and forth copying. I always like watching the TRS-80 Model III TRSDOS copy because the drives go back and forth at like twice the rate. I don't know if you can hear the floppy seeking. I'll shut up for a sec. Backups completed successfully. So now I've made a real disk from a disk image using the Lotharek. So let's do this. Let's actually eject this SD card image. I'll take my little disk pillow out of here. And we're going to reboot the machine, and I'm going to hold repeat and break so we don't boot from the Fred. And we'll see if my new disk works. Well, we're booting from the floppy drive. And there we have it, TRSDOS 4.4. I've now made a physical boot disk for this machine so that I can boot TRSDOS 4.4 from a floppy disk. Granted, 4.2 works for most of my needs, but 4.4 is the last version. Again, we'll talk about TRSDOS in a couple of videos from now. Oops, not format, you dumbass. Today is 9. It is, what, the 6th I said. It is 2024, and it is about 7:40. And there we are. We have a disk which should have no real files on it, but I can show you there are some system files on there. Yep, no matching files found. dir 0 sys. I wonder what these last few are. It'd be worth a look. Anyway, maybe next time. Anyway, we have a working TRSDOS 4.4 disk. I've made a real floppy disk from an SD card image. Now, it's worth noting, as I mentioned before, that for at least this particular operating system, this is more easily done using a hard disk. We'll cover some of that in the TRSDOS video. There's differences between the versions of TRSDOS as to what you can format and back up where and under what configurations, because TRSDOS is fun. Actually, TRSDOS is fun, but that's really the process. Having both physical and virtual media makes things really nice. Now, there are, of course, other ways to do this, more modern ways, grease weasels and the like, but if I have a working system, it seems to me that for as often as I do this, which is almost never, it's almost more fun to just use an emulator and a real working floppy drive. Now this process wouldn't be complete if we didn't actually label the diskette, right? Again, part of the fun. And these are the original labels that came with the discs. So I'm going to take one of these green ones. I'm going to call this, pen's already out, TRSDOS 2. 4.4, and today is 9/6/2024. I'm sorry for those of you from Europe. We Americans, right? Our date's weird. I'm aware of this. If it makes you feel better, I at least use the 24-hour clock. Okay, now, these labels adhesive is pretty horrid. As you can see, it just comes right off of there. So, I'm going to apply just a small little bit of, if I can get it out here, super glue to the disc so that I can attach this label. And I really don't want this label coming off in the drive. So now that that's on there, let's just push that down a bit before the glue dries. And there we have it. We have, oh, shadows, folks, shadows. We have a TRSDOS 2 4.4 disk made fresh in a real drive from a floppy image, labeled and all. So folks, I think that's going to do it. I think I fooled around long enough on this part 1 of my series, Storage on the 8s. Once again, happy Tandy. Thanks for joining me, and join me next time when I'll be talking about hard disks, hard disk interface, and hard disk operating systems. Oh, the combinations. It's going to be a great time. I'll catch you next time.